The Denver morning sun cast long shadows across the suburban street, but inside the Rodriguez household, darkness seemed to linger in every corner. Marcus sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The newspaper lay folded beside him, its headlines about local politics and sports scores feeling as foreign as hieroglyphs. "You're up early again," Sarah said softly, her footsteps careful on the linoleum floor. She moved around him like he was made of glass, and maybe he was. Maybe that's what 3 tours in Afghanistan did to a man, turned him into something fragile that everyone was afraid to touch. Marcus didn't look up from his coffee. Couldn't sleep. It was the same conversation they'd been having for 8 months now, ever since he'd come home. The same careful dance of words that said nothing and everything at once. Sarah poured herself coffee and sat across from him, her nurse's uniform crisp and ready for another 12-hour shift at Denver General. "Emma's got that parent-teacher conference today," she said, testing the waters. 3 o'clock. "I thought maybe—" "I can't." The words came out harsher than he intended. He finally looked up, seeing the hurt flash across her face before she could hide it. "I mean, I'm supposed to go to that thing today." "Thing?" Sarah's voice carried a note of hope that made his chest tight. "The group. The veteran thing Dr. Martinez recommended." She nodded quickly, trying not to show how relieved she looked. "That's good, Marcus. That's really good." The silence stretched between them like a canyon. Upstairs, Emma's alarm went off, followed by the sound of teenage feet hitting the floor. Their daughter would be down soon, moving through the kitchen like a ghost herself, grabbing a granola bar and avoiding eye contact with her father, who had become a stranger in their own home. Marcus stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "I should shower." "Marcus." Sarah's voice stopped him at the doorway. When he turned, she was looking at him with those brown eyes that had once seen all of him, every part that mattered. "I know this is hard, but we're still here. Emma and we're still here." He wanted to tell her that he knew, that he was grateful, that he loved them more than the weight crushing his chest would let him say. Instead, he nodded once and walked upstairs, leaving his wife sitting alone with 2 cups of coffee and the sound of their daughter getting ready for school. In the shower, Marcus let the hot water run over the scars that mapped his body like a topographical chart of violence. The shrapnel wound on his left shoulder, the burn scar on his forearm from the IED that had taken Johnson, the long thin line across his ribs from the firefight in Kandahar where he'd earned his nickname. They called him Falcon because of what happened that day, because when the dust settled and the smoke cleared, when Rodriguez and Patterson were pinned down behind that concrete barrier with Taliban fighters closing in, Marcus had done something that seemed to defy gravity itself. He'd fast roped down from the extraction helicopter, landed in the middle of the firefight, and somehow gotten both his brothers out alive. The medal citation called it extraordinary heroism under fire. The men in his unit called it flying like a bird of prey swooping down to protect its own. The nickname stuck, and for a while Marcus had worn it like armor. Now it felt like a joke. A falcon was supposed to soar, to hunt, to be strong and fierce and free. Marcus Rodriguez felt like he was buried alive, suffocating under the weight of memories and the impossibility of explaining to anyone what it was like to carry the ghosts of every friend who didn't make it home. He turned off the water and stood dripping in the bathroom, looking at himself in the mirror. 34 years old, but his eyes looked ancient. The man staring back at him was someone Sarah and Emma deserved better than, someone who jumped at car backfires and couldn't sleep through the night without seeing Patterson's face in his dreams. Today he would go to his first group therapy session. Today he would sit in a circle with other broken soldiers and pretend that talking about it would somehow make it better. But first, he had to get through breakfast without his daughter looking at him like he might disappear. The community center on East Colfax Avenue had seen better days. The brick exterior was weathered and tagged with fading graffiti, and the parking lot was cracked asphalt held together by hope and municipal neglect. Marcus sat in his truck for 10 minutes after arriving, hands gripping the steering wheel, telling himself he could still drive away. Through the windows, he could see other vehicles. A beat-up Honda Civic with military decals, a pristine Harley-Davidson that looked like it had never seen rain, and a van with handicap plates. His brothers and sisters in arms, all of them carrying their own invisible wounds. The meeting room smelled like burnt coffee and industrial disinfectant. Folding chairs were arranged in a circle, and Marcus counted 12 of them. Enough for a squad, he thought automatically. 7 were already occupied when he walked in, and the conversations died as they sized up the new guy. "You must be Marcus." The voice belonged to a tall black man with grey, creeping through his beard, and the kind of bearing that screamed former officer. "I'm James Williams, but everyone here calls me Preacher. Welcome to the island of misfit toys." A few people chuckled at that, and Marcus felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. He shook Preacher's hand, firm grip, eye contact, the way soldiers acknowledged each other. "Coffee's over there if you can stomach it," Preacher continued. "Fair warning, it tastes like motor oil, but it's caffeinated motor oil." Marcus filled a styrofoam cup and found a seat between a young Hispanic man with sleeve tattoos and an older woman whose right leg ended at the knee. Across the circle, a red-headed woman in her 30s gave him a small nod of recognition, one warrior acknowledging another. "All right, everyone," Preacher said, settling into his chair with a wince that suggested old injuries. "We've got a new face today, so let's do our usual introductions. Name, branch, and one thing that brought you joy this week. Tommy, you want to start?" The young man next to Marcus shifted in his seat. He couldn't have been more than 25, but his eyes held the kind of weariness that came from seeing too much too young. "Tommy Gutierrez, Army, 82nd Airborne, 2 tours in Iraq." He paused, running a hand through his black hair. "Joy this week. My nephew learned to ride his bike without training wheels, got to teach him myself." The introductions continued around the circle. Rosa, the woman with the prosthetic leg, had been a Navy corpsman. She'd found joy in successfully growing tomatoes in her apartment balcony garden. Jerry, a Vietnam vet with shaking hands, had enjoyed watching old Clint Eastwood movies with his grandson. When it came to Marcus, all eyes turned to him. His mouth felt dry despite the terrible coffee. Marcus Rodriguez, Army Rangers, Staff Sergeant, 3 tours in Afghanistan. He stopped, realizing everyone was waiting for the joy part. What had brought him joy this week? Emma saying good morning to him yesterday. Sarah not flinching when he'd accidentally slammed a cabinet door. My daughter smiled at me yesterday. First time in a while." Nods around the circle. They understood what that meant, what it cost, what it was worth. Preacher cleared his throat. "Marcus, you don't have to share anything today if you're not ready. But if you want to tell us why you're here, we're listening." Marcus looked around the circle at these faces. Some young, some old, all carrying scars you couldn't see. Tommy was fidgeting with a coin in his pocket. Rosa sat perfectly still, the way people did when they'd learned to control pain. Jerry's hands shook, but his eyes were steady and kind. "I can't sleep," Marcus said finally. "I mean, I sleep, but I dream about the friends who didn't make it home. About a mission where they called me Falcon because I saved 2 guys, but I keep thinking about all the ones I couldn't save." His voice cracked on the last word, and he was surprised to find his eyes wet. In the army, showing emotion was weakness. Here, in this circle of wounded warriors, it felt like the first honest thing he'd said in months. "Survivor's guilt," Rosa said quietly. "It's a real bitch." "Language, Rosa," Preacher said with mock sternness, which earned him a one-fingered salute from the former corpsman. "The thing about guilt," Jerry said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd been fighting this war for 50 years, "is that it's a luxury we can't afford. The dead don't want us to suffer for them. They want us to live for them." Tommy leaned forward. "Yeah, but how do you do that when everything feels empty?" "1 day at a time," Preacher said. "Some days, 1 hour at a time. Some days, 1 breath at a time. But you do it together. That's why we're here." Marcus looked around the circle again, and for the first time in 8 months, he didn't feel completely alone. These people understood what it was like to carry ghosts. They understood what it meant to come home from war, but never really leave the battlefield behind. "So, what's your story, Falcon?" Rosa asked, using his nickname like it wasn't a burden, but a badge of honor. "What made them call you that?" And slowly, carefully, like a man learning to walk again after a long injury, Marcus began to tell them about the day he learned to fly. Marcus stared at his hands for a long moment before he began to speak. The group waited patiently. They'd all been where he was now, standing at the edge of a story that hurt to tell, but needed telling. "It was September 15th, 2022, he said quietly. "We were running a patrol in Kandahar province, supposed to be routine. Check on some villages, hand out supplies, show presence. Nothing we hadn't done 100 times before." He could feel himself slipping back into that day, the way the desert sun had beat down mercilessly, the way the dust got into everything. Your mouth, your eyes, the action of your rifle. Tommy leaned forward slightly, recognizing something in Marcus's voice. Rodriguez and Patterson were my guys, Marcus continued. Rodriguez, Miguel. We called him Miggy. Kid from El Paso couldn't have been more than 22. Always talking about this girl back home, Maria, showing everyone pictures of their baby daughter he'd never met. Patterson was older, maybe 30. Detroit. Tough as nails, but had this laugh that could crack you up from 100 meters away. The room was completely silent now, except for the hum of fluorescent lights and Jerry's slightly labored breathing. The IED went off about 2 clicks from the village. Caught our lead vehicle. Humvee just disappeared in a cloud of smoke and debris. When it cleared, we could see Rodriguez and Patterson trapped behind what was left of a concrete barrier. Taliban fighters were moving in from 3 sides. Marcus's voice grew steadier as he fell into the familiar rhythm of an after-action report, but Rosa could see his hands shaking slightly. Our LT called for air support, but the closest Apache was 20 minutes out. Too long. Radio chatter was saying the Tangos had RPGs, which meant Rodriguez and Patterson were sitting ducks. They were wounded, couldn't move, and we couldn't get to them without crossing 50 meters of open ground under fire. Preacher nodded slowly. He'd been in similar situations, knew the impossible mathematics of combat where every second cost lives, and every decision carried the weight of brothers' blood. That's when the extraction bird showed up, Marcus said. Black Hawk coming in low and fast. Pilot was this crazy Marine, callsign Wildcard. He hovered over the firefight like he was parking at a grocery store, taking small arms fire like it was rain. Tommy was hanging on every word now. This was the kind of story that got passed around in barracks and mess halls, the kind that became legend. I don't remember deciding to do it, Marcus admitted. 1 second I was behind cover with my squad, the next I was clipping onto the fast rope. 40 feet of rope between me and a hot LZ with maybe 20 Taliban fighters, shooting at anything that moved. He paused, took a sip of the terrible coffee and continued. The rope burned through my gloves was the least of my problems. I hit the ground in the middle of hell, bullets snapping past my head, dust kicking up all around me, but I could see Rodriguez and Patterson, maybe 30 meters away. Rodriguez was unconscious, bleeding from his head. Patterson was trying to return fire with a busted arm. The story was pouring out of him now. 8 months of keeping it locked inside, finally finding release in this circle of people who understood what it meant to make split-second decisions that haunted you forever. I laid down covering fire and sprinted to their position. Patterson looked at me like I was crazy, which I probably was. "What the hell are you doing here, Sergeant?" he yelled over the gunfire. I told him we were leaving, all 3 of us, and he laughed that crazy laugh of his even with a shattered collarbone. Marcus's eyes were distant now, seeing that day instead of the community center room. Getting Rodriguez up was the hardest part. Kid was dead weight, bleeding but still breathing. Patterson couldn't use his right arm, so it was basically me carrying Rodriguez while Patterson provided what cover he could with his offhand. We had maybe 50 meters to the extraction point. "How'd you make it?" Tommy asked quietly. Marcus looked at him, and for a moment his expression was haunted. "I honestly don't know. Training, adrenaline, pure dumb luck. But we moved like we were connected by invisible wire. Patterson covered our 6 while I carried Rodriguez. When Patterson stumbled, I grabbed him too. Somehow we made it to the rope." He stopped, remembering the weight of Rodriguez's body, the way Patterson had gritted his teeth and climbed that rope one-handed, while enemy fire sparked off the helicopter's armor. "We all made it up," he said simply. "Rodriguez spent 3 weeks in a coma but pulled through. Patterson got a medical discharge but kept his arm. And everyone started calling me Falcon because someone said I'd swooped down like a bird of prey to save my chicks." The silence stretched for a long moment before Rosa spoke. "So what's the problem?" she asked gently. "You saved them. You did your job. You were a hero." Marcus's face crumpled slightly. "That was my 3rd tour. By the time I came home 6 months later, Rodriguez had been killed by a sniper in Helmand Province. Patterson overdosed on pain pills in a Detroit motel room 2 months after I got back. The weight of it settled over the group like a heavy blanket. This was the real story. Not just the heroism, but what came after. The way war kept taking pieces of you long after the shooting stopped. I keep thinking," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper, "maybe if I'd been faster that day, or smarter, or braver, maybe I could have saved them from everything that came after. Maybe the nickname was wrong. Maybe I'm not a Falcon at all." The silence in the group after Marcus finished his story was different from before, heavier, more respectful. These were people who understood that some stories didn't have clean endings, that heroism sometimes came with a price tag that kept collecting interest for years. Preacher was the first to speak. "Marcus, can I ask you something?" Marcus nodded, still looking at his hands. "When you fast roped down that day, what were you thinking about?" "Getting my guys out." "Not about yourself? Not about the risk?" "No." Marcus looked up. "Just them." "And when you carried Rodriguez while Patterson covered you, what were you focused on?" "Making it to the extraction point, keeping them alive." Preacher leaned back in his chair. "So for that entire firefight, your focus was on saving lives. Not taking them, not thinking about medals or glory, just saving lives." "Yeah, but—" "No buts," Rosa interrupted, her voice firm but not unkind. "You did your job. You saved 2 men that day. What happened to them later? The sniper, the overdose, that wasn't on you. That was the war taking more pieces." Tommy shifted in his seat, and Marcus could see something working behind the young veteran's eyes. "I lost my best friend too," Tommy said quietly. "Danny Kowalski. Made it through 2 tours in Iraq without a scratch. Came home to San Antonio, got married, had a kid. Then one day he just couldn't carry it anymore. Found him in his garage with the car running." The group absorbed this revelation. Jerry reached over and squeezed Tommy's shoulder with a shaking hand. "The thing is," Tommy continued, "I used to think it was my fault somehow. Like if I'd called him more, or visited more, or been a better friend, maybe he'd still be here. But my therapist, the one I saw before I found this group, she told me something that stuck." He looked directly at Marcus. "She said we can't save people from themselves. We can love them, support them, be there for them. But we can't carry their pain for them. And we sure as hell can't carry guilt for things that were never our responsibility in the first place." Marcus felt something shift in his chest, like a knot loosening just slightly. "But if I'd been stronger—" "You rappelled into active combat to save 2 wounded soldiers," Jerry said, his voice carrying the authority of 5 decades of survival. "Son, I've been to 3 wars, and I can tell you that what you did that day was the definition of strength. The fact that you're sitting here torn up about what happened to those boys later, that tells me you're exactly the kind of soldier they needed that day." "Jerry's right," Preacher added. "And here's something else to consider. Rodriguez got to go home to his family because of you. Even if it was only for a few months, his daughter got to meet her father. His wife got to hold him again. Patterson got medical treatment, got to see Detroit one more time, got to try to build a life. You gave them that chance." Marcus felt tears threatening again, but this time they didn't feel like weakness. They felt like relief, like pressure finally being released from a valve that had been sealed too tight for too long. "I know it hurts," Rosa said softly. "Survivor's guilt is like phantom pain from an amputated limb. It feels real even though the limb is gone. But you can't let it consume you. Your wife and daughter need you here, alive and present. Not perfect, not without scars, but here." The session continued for another hour. They talked about coping strategies, about the difference between healthy guilt and destructive guilt, about ways to honor fallen comrades without destroying themselves in the process. When it was over, Marcus felt drained but somehow lighter, like he'd been carrying a 100-pound pack and finally gotten to set it down. As the group was breaking up, Tommy approached him in the parking lot. "Hey, Falcon," he said. And the nickname didn't sound like mockery anymore. "You want to grab some coffee, real coffee, not that swill Preacher serves?" Marcus hesitated. For 8 months he'd isolated himself, pushed away everyone who tried to get close. But something about Tommy's easy smile and the understanding in his eyes made the decision simple. "Yeah," he said, "I'd like that." They ended up at a 24-hour diner on Federal Boulevard, the kind of place that served breakfast all day and didn't ask questions about why 2 guys were drinking coffee at 3 in the afternoon, looking like they'd been through a war. "So what's your story?" Marcus asked after they'd ordered. "What brought you to the group?" Tommy stirred sugar into his coffee, considering his answer. "Same as you, really. Came home angry, started drinking too much, nearly lost my family. My sister, she's the one who dragged me to that first meeting. Literally dragged me. I was so pissed at her I didn't talk to her for a month. But you kept going back." "Yeah, I kept going back. Because for the first time since I got home, I was in a room full of people who didn't need me to explain why I woke up in a cold sweat, or why I couldn't be in crowds, or why the sound of fireworks made me want to crawl under a table. Marcus nodded. That was exactly how he'd felt today. The thing about Preacher, Tommy continued, is that he doesn't try to fix you. He just gives you permission to be broken while you figure out how to put the pieces back together. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, two warriors sharing the kind of peace that could only exist between people who'd seen the same darkness. "You going back next week?" Tommy asked eventually. Marcus thought about Sarah's hopeful face that morning, about Emma's rare smile, about the way it had felt to finally tell someone about Rodriguez and Patterson. "Yeah," he said, "I think I am." As he drove home that evening, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in months, the possibility that tomorrow might be better than today. Not perfect, not pain-free, but better. And for a man who'd been drowning in guilt and isolation, better felt like a miracle. Sarah was washing dishes when Marcus walked through the front door at 6:30 p.m., and for the first time in months, she didn't tense up at the sound of his key in the lock. Something was different about the way he moved. Not lighter exactly, but less like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. "How did it go?" she asked, not turning around from the sink, but watching his reflection in the kitchen window. Marcus hung his keys on the hook by the door, a small routine that had somehow become monumental in recent months. "Better than I expected. I talked to them about Afghanistan." Sarah's hands stilled in the soapy water. In 8 months, Marcus had barely mentioned the war except in fragments during nightmares. She turned to face him, searching his face for signs of the breakdown she'd been afraid would come. "That must have been hard," she said carefully. "Yeah, but also good, I think. There's this guy, Tommy, about Emma's age when I first deployed. He invited me for coffee after." Marcus moved to the refrigerator and pulled out a beer, then stopped, looking at it for a long moment before putting it back and reaching for a bottle of water instead. Sarah noticed the small gesture, another tiny victory in a war she didn't fully understand, but was learning to fight alongside him. "Are you hungry? I made that chicken thing you used to like, before—" She caught herself, but Marcus heard the unfinished sentence anyway. "Before he came home, before everything changed." "Actually, yeah. I think I am hungry." It was such a simple thing, but Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. For months, Marcus had eaten mechanically, food becoming fuel rather than pleasure. The fact that he was actually hungry felt like a small miracle. Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway, backpack slung over one shoulder, car keys in her hand. At 17, she'd inherited Sarah's quick intelligence and Marcus's stubborn streak, but lately she'd been moving through the house like she was afraid to make noise. "I'm going to study at Jessica's," she announced, not quite meeting her father's eyes. "What subject?" Marcus asked, and Emma looked up, surprised by the question. "Chemistry. We have a test tomorrow on molecular structures." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "I remember struggling with that stuff in high school. The way Mrs. Patterson explained it never made sense to me." He paused, then added, "You want me to look at it with you when you get home? I mean, if you want. No pressure." Emma stared at him like he'd just spoken in a foreign language. For months, her father had been physically present but emotionally absent, lost in a world she couldn't access. Now he was asking about chemistry homework. Yeah, okay, I'll be home by 9. After she left, Sarah and Marcus sat down to dinner. The silence between them was different now, less heavy, more comfortable. Sarah found herself really looking at her husband for the first time in months, seeing past the exhaustion and distance to the man she'd fallen in love with 12 years ago. "The group meets every Tuesday," Marcus said as he cut his chicken. "I think I want to keep going." "Good," Sarah said simply. Then, taking a breath, she added, "Marcus, I've been thinking about going to counseling too. There's this support group for military spouses dealing with PTSD. I know I'm not the one who went to war, but you've been fighting your own battle," Marcus finished. "With me. For me. I'm sorry, Sarah. I know this hasn't been fair to you and Emma." Sarah reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. His skin was warm and familiar, calloused from years of handling weapons and equipment, but gentle in the way she remembered from when they were young and everything seemed possible. "We're a family," she said. "That means we fight together. All of us." That night, when Emma came home, Marcus was waiting in the living room with her chemistry textbook and a yellow legal pad covered with his scratchy handwriting. "Okay," he said, patting the couch beside him. "Molecular structures. Let's see what we're dealing with." For the next hour, father and daughter bent over diagrams and formulas, Marcus explaining concepts in the patient, methodical way he'd once taught new recruits how to field strip their rifles. Emma found herself relaxing for the first time in months, remembering why she used to run to him with scraped knees and broken toys, believing he could fix anything. "You're actually pretty good at this," she said, as they worked through a particularly complex problem. "I had to take a lot of chemistry in the army. Explosives, chemical weapons, decontamination procedures. Turns out some of it actually applies to your homework." Emma laughed, really laughed, and the sound filled the house like music. Sarah, folding laundry in the bedroom, heard it and had to sit down on the bed, overwhelmed by relief and hope in equal measure. "Dad," Emma said quietly as they finished up, "I'm glad you went to that group today." Marcus looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw Sarah's eyes and determination, but also something that was uniquely Emma. She'd grown up while he was gone, not just physically but emotionally, forced to mature in ways that military kids always did. "Me too, kiddo, me too." Later that night, as Sarah and Marcus lay in bed with the lights off but neither of them asleep, Sarah spoke into the darkness. "I love you," she said. "I know things have been hard and I know we have a long way to go, but I want you to know that I never stopped loving you. Not for 1 second." Marcus turned toward her in the darkness, and for the first time in months he reached for her hand. "I love you too," he said, and his voice was thick with emotion. "I don't know how to get back to who I was before, but maybe I can figure out how to be someone new, someone better." "You don't have to be better," Sarah whispered. "You just have to be here, present, with us." And lying there in the dark, holding his wife's hand and listening to the sound of his daughter's breathing from down the hall, Marcus thought that maybe being present was something he could learn how to do again. The nightmare came at 3:17 a.m., the same as always. Marcus was back in the helicopter, fast roping down into the firefight, but this time when he reached Rodriguez and Patterson, they were already dead. Their eyes were open and accusing, asking him why he'd taken so long, why he hadn't been fast enough, strong enough, better. He woke, gasping, his t-shirt soaked in sweat, Sarah's hand on his shoulder. "It's okay," she was saying, her voice calm and practiced. "You're home, you're safe." But Marcus could still smell the cordite and dust, could still hear the snap of bullets passing close to his head. The transition from dream to reality felt like surfacing from deep water, disorienting and painful. "Sorry," he muttered, sitting up and running his hands through his hair. "I'm sorry." "Don't apologize," Sarah said, rubbing his back in slow circles. "Do you want to talk about it?" For 8 months, Marcus had said no to that question. Tonight, something was different. It was the same one. The mission, but wrong. This time I was too late. He looked at Sarah in the dim light filtering through their curtains. The weird thing is, in the dream, Rodriguez and Patterson looked the way they did when they died. Rodriguez with the bullet wound, Patterson, well, you know. Sarah nodded. She'd heard the stories in fragments during other nights like this one, piecing together the tragedy from Marcus's broken sleep-talking and the occasional detail he'd shared during his clearer moments. "What do you think, Doctor?" "Martinez would say about that?" she asked gently. Marcus had been seeing the VA therapist for 6 weeks now, individual sessions to complement the group meetings. Dr. Martinez was a veteran herself, Air Force, Iraq War, and had a way of cutting through Marcus's defenses without making him feel attacked. "She'd probably say my brain is processing guilt and trauma by creating scenarios where I have control over outcomes I never had control over in the first place," Marcus said, repeating almost word for word something from one of their sessions. "Smart woman." "Yeah, she is." Marcus looked at the clock. "I should try to get back to sleep. You have that early shift tomorrow." But Sarah didn't move to lie back down. Instead, she turned to face him more fully. "Marcus, can I ask you something? And will you give me a real answer, not the one you think I want to hear?" He nodded, suddenly more alert. "Are you getting better? I mean, really getting better? Because I can see small changes. Tonight with Emma, the way you've been eating, going to the group. But I need to know if you feel like you're healing or if you're just going through the motions." It was such a direct question that Marcus felt momentarily off balance. Sarah had always been straightforward. It was one of the things he'd loved about her when they met, but months of careful conversations had made him forget how refreshing her honesty could be. "I don't know if better is the right word," he said slowly. I think I'm starting to understand the difference between healing and just surviving. For the first few months after I got home, I was just trying to make it through each day, without falling apart completely. Now with the group, with Dr. Martinez, with you and Emma, I think I'm actually trying to figure out how to live again. Sarah reached for his hand in the darkness. That's all I needed to hear. That you're trying. They lay back down, and this time Marcus was able to drift back into a dreamless sleep. When his alarm went off at 6 a.m., he felt more rested than he had in weeks. Over breakfast, Emma was chattering about the chemistry test she'd aced thanks to their study session, and Marcus found himself actually listening instead of just nodding at appropriate intervals. She was talking about college applications, about wanting to study environmental science, about a boy named David who sat next to her in AP English. "David sounds like trouble," Marcus said with mock seriousness, and Emma rolled her eyes. "Dad, you don't even know him." "I know he's 17 and male, that's all I need to know." Sarah laughed from across the kitchen. "Give the poor boy a chance, Marcus. Not every teenage guy is plotting to corrupt our daughter." "I'll consider it," Marcus said solemnly, "after I run a full background check." Emma groaned dramatically, but she was smiling. This was the father she remembered from before the deployments, protective but playful, strong but not scary. That afternoon, Marcus found himself at the community center an hour early for group. He wasn't sure why he'd come so early, but something about the familiar building felt grounding now, instead of intimidating. He found Preacher in the meeting room, arranging chairs and checking the coffee pot. "You're early," Preacher observed. "Everything okay?" "Had the nightmare again last night," Marcus said, grabbing a chair and helping set up the circle. "But afterward, I talked to Sarah about it." "Actually talked, not just apologized and tried to go back to sleep." Preacher nodded approvingly. "That's progress. How'd it feel?" "Scary. Good. Both, I guess." "That sounds about right. Healing isn't comfortable. If it was easy, we'd all be fixed already." Other members began filtering in. Tommy with his easy smile, Rosa moving efficiently despite her prosthetic, Jerry with his gentle handshake and knowing eyes. Marcus realized he was actually looking forward to the session, to the hour where he could be completely honest about his struggles without having to protect anyone's feelings or manage their reactions. As they settled into their circle, Preacher looked around the group. "Before we start tonight, I want to talk about something. We've got some new faces this week, and Marcus here has been with us for a few sessions now. I think it's important to remember that healing isn't a straight line. Some days will be better than others. Some weeks you'll feel like you're making real progress, and other weeks you'll feel like you're right back where you started." He paused, making eye contact with each person in turn. "The important thing is that you keep showing up. For yourselves, for your families, and for each other. Because the truth is, we're all we've got. The civilians in our lives love us and want to help us, but they can't understand what we've been through. We can. And that understanding is powerful medicine." Marcus felt the truth of those words settle into his bones. For the first time since coming home, he was exactly where he needed to be. 3 weeks into his group therapy journey, Marcus was settling into the familiar rhythm of Tuesday evenings when Preacher introduced a newcomer to their circle. The young woman couldn't have been more than 25, with short auburn hair and the kind of rigid posture that screamed fresh out of service. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet Amy Chen," Preacher said as the woman took a seat between Jerry and Rosa. "Amy, these are the people I was telling you about. Best support system you'll find this side of the Mississippi." Amy nodded curtly, her green eyes scanning the circle with the hypervigilance Marcus recognized in himself. She wore jeans and a plain black t-shirt, but something about the way she carried herself suggested she'd be more comfortable in uniform. "Amy served 3 tours as a combat medic in Syria," Preacher continued. "Just got out 6 months ago." The introductions went around the circle as usual, but Marcus noticed Amy's attention sharpen when it was his turn to speak. "Marcus Rodriguez, Army Rangers Staff Sergeant, 3 tours Afghanistan." He paused, then added, "This group probably saved my marriage, maybe my life." When it came to Amy's turn, she spoke in clipped military tones. "Amy Chen, Sergeant First Class, 68W Combat Medic, 1st Armored Division." She stopped there, offering no personal details, no mention of what brought her joy that week. The session continued, but Marcus found himself watching Amy out of the corner of his eye. She reminded him of himself 3 weeks ago, coiled tight, ready to bolt at the first sign of vulnerability. When Rosa shared about struggling with phantom pain in her amputated leg, Amy's expression never changed. When Tommy talked about his ongoing battle with alcohol cravings, she remained stone-faced. After the meeting, as people were filing out into the parking lot, Marcus noticed Amy sitting alone in her car, a beat-up Honda Civic with military stickers covering the back window. She was gripping the steering wheel and staring straight ahead, and Marcus recognized that look. He'd worn it himself not so long ago. He tapped on her passenger window. Amy startled, her hand moving instinctively toward where her sidearm would have been, before she recognized him and rolled the window down. "You okay?" Marcus asked. "I'm fine," she replied automatically. "Just processing." Marcus nodded. "Mind if I ask you something? And you can tell me to go to hell if you want." Amy's mouth almost twitched into a smile at that. "Shoot. How long since you've talked to someone who gets it? I mean, really gets it?" Amy was quiet for a long moment. "Define talk to." "I mean actually talked. Not reported to superior officers, not filled out forms, not answered questions from VA doctors who've never been downrange. I mean, sat with someone who's been where you've been and just talked." "About 2 years," Amy said quietly. Marcus nodded. "You want to grab coffee? There's this diner Tommy and I go to sometimes. Food's terrible, coffee's worse, but it's quiet and nobody bothers you." Amy hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, okay." 30 minutes later, they were sitting in the same booth Marcus and Tommy had claimed weeks earlier. Amy ordered coffee black and sat with her back to the wall, eyes constantly scanning the room, more hypervigilance that Marcus knew intimately. "So, what's your story?" Marcus asked after they'd ordered. Amy's jaw tightened. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what brought you to the group? You don't have to tell me anything, but sometimes it helps to practice with someone who's not going to judge you before you share with the whole circle." Amy stared into her coffee for a long time before speaking. "I lost 7 soldiers in my last tour, all KIA, all good kids who should have made it home." Marcus felt his chest tighten. "That's a heavy load to carry." "The thing is," Amy continued, "I was their medic. My job was to keep them alive, to patch them up and get them home to their families. And I failed 7 times. Combat medic is one of the hardest jobs in the military," Marcus said carefully. "You can't save everyone." Amy's eyes flashed with anger. "Everyone keeps saying that. The chaplain, the counselors, my family. You can't save everyone, Amy. You did your best, Amy. It's not your fault, Amy." She took a shaky breath. "But what if it was? What if I missed something? What if I could have done more?" Marcus recognized the spiral she was in, the same one that had consumed him for months after Rodriguez and Patterson died. The endless replay of events, searching for the moment where different choices might have led to different outcomes. "Can I tell you something?" Marcus said. 3 weeks ago, I was sitting in that same group, thinking I was a fraud. They called me Falcon because I saved 2 guys in Afghanistan, but both of them died after we came home. I kept thinking that if I'd been better, stronger, faster, maybe I could have saved them from everything that came after." Amy looked up from her coffee, really looking at him for the first time. "What changed your mind?" "The group. Hearing other people's stories. Realizing that we can't control what happens after we do our job. We can only control what we do in the moment when it matters." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Those 7 soldiers, when they were wounded, when they needed help, you were there. You did everything you could with what you had. That's what being a medic means." But nothing," Marcus said firmly. "You think those soldiers would want you destroying yourself with guilt? You think they'd want their medic to give up, to stop living, to carry their deaths like a punishment?" Amy's composure cracked slightly, and Marcus could see tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "I don't know how to let go of it," she whispered. "You don't have to let go of them," Marcus said gently. "You just have to learn to carry their memory without letting it crush you. That's what the group teaches you, how to honor the dead by choosing to keep living." They sat in silence for a while, 2 warriors sharing the kind of understanding that couldn't be taught, only earned through shared experience. "Will you be there next week?" Amy asked finally. "Every Tuesday," Marcus promised. "And so will Tommy and Rosa and Jerry and all the others. We'll be there until you don't need us anymore, and even after that." As they parted ways in the parking lot, Marcus felt something shift in his understanding of his own journey. For weeks, he'd been focused on his own healing, his own progress. Tonight, sitting with Amy and recognizing his younger, more broken self in her rigid posture and haunted eyes, he realized that healing wasn't just about getting better. It was about being strong enough to help others find their way out of the darkness too. The call came at 2:30 a.m. on a Thursday, jolting Marcus from the first full night's sleep he'd had in weeks. Sarah answered the phone, her voice thick with sleep and concern. "Marcus, it's for you," she said, handing him the phone. "Someone named Amy." Marcus was instantly alert. Amy had only been coming to group for 2 weeks, but something in Sarah's tone told him this wasn't a social call. "Amy? What's going on?" Her voice was shaky, barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry to call so late. I didn't know who else, and I can't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I see them, all 7 of them." Marcus was already getting out of bed, moving quietly so as not to wake Emma. "Where are you right now?" "Home, my apartment, but I keep thinking—" She trailed off, and Marcus felt his heart rate spike. "Amy, talk to me. What are you thinking? That maybe this is too hard? That maybe I'm not strong enough to keep doing this?" Marcus recognized the code in her words, the way soldiers talked around the edges of thoughts too dangerous to speak directly. He'd been there himself, standing at the edge of that particular cliff. "I'm coming over," he said. "What's your address?" "You don't have to—" "Address, Chen, that's an order." Despite everything, Amy almost smiled at the command voice. She rattled off an address in Aurora, about 20 minutes from Marcus's house. Marcus dressed quickly, leaving a note for Sarah explaining where he'd gone. She was sitting up in bed when he finished. "Is she okay?" Sarah asked. "I don't know, but I have to find out." Sarah nodded, understanding without explanation that this was part of Marcus's own healing, learning to be the kind of person who showed up when someone needed help. Amy's apartment complex was one of those generic developments that had sprung up near military bases across the country. Cheap, functional, temporary. Marcus found her door and knocked softly. When Amy opened it, she looked like she'd been crying for hours. Her military bearing was completely gone, replaced by the hollow-eyed exhaustion of someone who'd been fighting a war with herself. "I'm okay," she said automatically, but her voice cracked on the words. "No, you're not," Marcus said gently. "And that's okay too." Amy's apartment was sparse, a couch, a TV, military photos on the walls, and medical textbooks stacked on a card table. It looked like a place where someone was camping rather than living. They sat on the couch, and Amy finally began to really talk about what had happened in Syria. About Martinez, 19 years old from Phoenix, who'd taken shrapnel to the chest and died in her arms despite everything she'd tried. About Jackson, the wisecracking kid from Alabama who'd stepped on an IED and bled out faster than she could work. About Williams, Thompson, Rodriguez, Hayes, and Murphy, 7 names that had become an endless loop in her head, 7 failures that she carried like stones in her chest. "I keep thinking about their families," Amy said, tears streaming down her face. "Their parents, their wives, their kids. They trusted me to bring their boys home, and I failed them." Marcus listened without interrupting, recognizing his own voice in her words. His own guilt and self-recrimination played back with different names and different faces. When Amy finally ran out of words, Marcus spoke quietly. "You know what I learned in group? What preacher taught me? The war doesn't end when you come home, it just changes battlefields. Over there we fought an enemy we could see, with weapons we understood. Here the enemy is invisible. It's guilt and grief and the weight of things we couldn't control." Amy wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "How do you fight something you can't see?" "The same way we fought over there," Marcus said. "With your squad. You don't do it alone." He pulled out his phone and showed her his contacts list. Tommy's number. Rosa's, Jerry's, Preacher's, even mine. You call any of us day or night, when the thoughts get too dark. That's what we do, we watch each other's backs. But what if I'm too broken? What if I can't get better? Marcus thought about his own journey, the nightmares that still came, the moments of panic in crowded spaces, the work he still had to do every single day to stay connected to Sarah and Emma. "Getting better isn't about going back to who you were before," he said. "It's about learning to live with who you are now. And you don't have to be perfect to be worth saving, Amy. You just have to be willing to keep trying." They talked until sunrise, Marcus sharing his own story in more detail than he'd ever told anyone except the group. As the first light filtered through Amy's blinds, she looked more exhausted, but somehow less desperate. "Will you come with me to group next week?" she asked. "I think I'm ready to actually talk this time." "I'll be there," Marcus promised. "We all will." When Marcus got home that morning, Sarah was making breakfast and Emma was getting ready for school. They both looked at him with questions in their eyes. "Everything okay?" Sarah asked. Marcus thought about Amy's tears, about the way her voice had sounded on the phone, about the long night of holding vigil with someone who reminded him so much of himself. "Yeah," he said, and realized he meant it. "Everything's going to be okay." That evening, Marcus called Preacher to let him know about Amy's crisis, and his response to it. "You did good, Marcus," Preacher said. "That's what recovery looks like, when you're strong enough to help pull someone else out of the hole you've been in. I kept thinking about something you said the first night I came to group, about how we're all we've got. It's true, but it's not a burden, it's a privilege. You get to be the person for Amy that Tommy and Rosa and Jerry were for you. That's how healing works. It's not just individual, it's collective." As Marcus hung up the phone, he realized that somewhere in the process of helping Amy through her darkest night, something had shifted in his own recovery. He wasn't just surviving anymore, wasn't just getting through each day. He was actively participating in his own life again, and in the lives of the people who mattered to him. For the first time since coming home from Afghanistan, Staff Sergeant Marcus Falcon Rodriguez felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. 6 months after his first group session, Marcus stood in front of the bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie with steady hands. Today was different. Today he was going back to work, not the construction job he'd tried and failed at twice since coming home, but something that actually mattered. The Denver VA Medical Center had offered him a position as a peer support specialist, helping other veterans navigate the transition from military to civilian life. It wasn't the career he'd planned, but as Dr. Martinez had pointed out during one of their sessions, sometimes the best plans were the ones you never saw coming. "You look good," Sarah said, appearing in the doorway with a cup of coffee and a smile that reminded him why he'd fallen in love with her 12 years ago. Professional. "Like someone who has his life together." "Do I?" Marcus asked, accepting the coffee. "Have my life together, I mean." Sarah considered the question seriously, the way she always did when he asked something that mattered. "You have Tuesday night group meetings that you never miss. You help Emma with her homework, without getting frustrated when she doesn't understand something the first time. You sleep through most nights now without nightmares. You laugh at my terrible jokes and actually mean it." She paused, reaching up to straighten his collar. "I'd say that's pretty together for a work in progress." Emma appeared behind her mother, wearing the University of Colorado sweatshirt she'd gotten after being accepted into their environmental science program. At 18, she'd grown into the kind of young woman who could light up a room just by walking into it, and Marcus felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with his own accomplishments. "Dad, are you nervous?" she asked, and Marcus was struck by how adult she sounded. When had his little girl become someone who asked him thoughtful questions about his emotional state? "Yeah, I am," he admitted, "but good nervous. The kind that means you're about to do something that matters." Emma hugged him, quick and fierce. "I'm proud of you," she said into his shoulder, "for going to the group, for getting better, for taking this job. I know it wasn't easy." As Marcus drove to work that morning, he thought about the conversation he'd had with Preacher the week before when he'd announced he was taking the VA job. "You ready for this?" Preacher had asked. "Working with veterans who were where you were 8 months ago?" "I don't know if anyone's ever ready," Marcus had replied, "but I think I'm ready to try." The VA Medical Center was a sprawling complex of buildings that tried hard to look welcoming, but couldn't quite hide their institutional nature. Marcus found the Readjustment Counseling Office and introduced himself to his supervisor, Dr. Patricia Valdez, a woman in her 50s who radiated the kind of calm competence that came from decades of helping broken people find their way back to wholeness. "Your first case is interesting," she said, handing him a file. 23-year-old Marine, 2 tours in Afghanistan. Having trouble adjusting to civilian life, struggling with anger issues, can't hold down a job. Sound familiar? Marcus opened the file and read the name. Corporal David Martinez. He looked up at Dr. Valdez with raised eyebrows. "Emma's boyfriend?" he asked. "Small world," Dr. Valdez said with a smile. "Is that going to be a problem?" Marcus thought about it. David had been coming around the house for 3 months now, polite and respectful, but carrying himself with the rigid control Marcus recognized in himself. Emma had mentioned that David had served overseas, but she'd never gone into details, and Marcus had never pressed. "No," he said finally. "I think it might actually help." An hour later, Marcus was sitting across from David Martinez in a small counseling room, watching the young Marine struggle with the same demons that had nearly destroyed Marcus's own family. "Emma doesn't know I'm here," David said. his hands clenched in his lap. She knows I served, but she doesn't know about the other stuff. The anger, the drinking, the nights I can't sleep. Marcus nodded, remembering his own desperate attempts to hide his struggles from the people he loved most. What kind of other stuff? He asked gently. David's story came out in fragments. The IED that had killed his best friend, the guilt over surviving when better men hadn't, the rage that seemed to come from nowhere and consume everything. It was Marcus's story with different names and places, the same war fought on the same invisible battlefield. I love Emma, David said, his voice cracking, but I'm scared I'm going to hurt her. Not physically, he added quickly, but the way I am now. I'm not good for anyone. Can I tell you something? Marcus said. 8 months ago I was sitting in a group therapy session thinking the exact same thing about my wife and daughter. I was convinced that they'd be better off without me, that I was too broken to be the husband and father they deserved. David looked up, really seeing Marcus for the first time since the session began. What changed? I learned the difference between being broken and being unfixable, Marcus said. I learned that healing doesn't mean going back to who you were before. It means figuring out who you can be now. And most importantly, I learned that you don't have to do it alone. By the end of the session, David had agreed to join Marcus's Tuesday night group. As they walked out of the building together, Marcus felt the strange satisfaction of having come full circle from the man who needed help to the man who could provide it. That evening at group, Marcus watched David take his place in the circle with the same rigid posture and guarded expression Marcus had worn 6 months earlier. Amy was there too, looking healthier and more relaxed than she had since joining the group. Tommy was celebrating 6 months of sobriety. Rosa had started dating someone, a fellow veteran she'd met at an adaptive sports program. As Preacher called the session to order, Marcus looked around the circle and realized that this was what healing looked like. Not a destination you arrived at, but a community you built, one story at a time, one Tuesday night at a time. Before we start tonight, Preacher said, Marcus has something he'd like to share with the group. Marcus stood, feeling the weight of everyone's attention, but not the crushing anxiety he would have felt months ago. 6 months ago, I walked into this room convinced that I was too broken to be fixed, too damaged to be useful to anyone. I was wrong. He looked at each face in turn. Tommy, Rosa, Jerry, Amy, and now David. This group taught me that healing isn't about becoming perfect. It's about becoming present. It's about showing up for yourself and for the people who matter to you. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Today I started a new job helping other veterans find their way back from the places we've all been. And I realized that everything I've learned in this room, about asking for help, about carrying each other, about honoring the dead by choosing to keep living, all of that made me qualified to do something I never thought I'd be able to do again. Serve. The applause was quiet but heartfelt, the kind that came from people who understood what it cost to stand up and claim your own healing. As the session continued, Marcus felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. He wasn't the same man who had fast-roped into that firefight in Afghanistan 3 years ago, and he wasn't the broken soldier who had come home and nearly lost everything that mattered. He was someone new, scarred but not defeated, wounded but not destroyed, carrying his ghosts but not carried away by them. Staff Sergeant Marcus Falcon Rodriguez had finally learned to fly again. 1 year after his first group session, Marcus stood at the podium in the Denver VA Medical Center's main auditorium, looking out at an audience of veterans, family members, and medical staff. The occasion was the annual Veteran Wellness Conference, and Marcus had been asked to give the keynote address on the topic of peer support and recovery. In the front row sat his anchors, Sarah, beautiful and proud, Emma, home from her first semester of college, Dr. Martinez, his therapist who had helped him find the words for his pain, and Preacher, the man who had taught him that strength sometimes meant admitting weakness. Scattered throughout the audience were faces Marcus recognized from his work, veterans he'd helped navigate their first steps toward healing, family members who had learned alongside their loved ones that recovery was a team sport, medical professionals who did the hard work of putting broken people back together piece by piece. In the third row, David Martinez sat next to Amy Chen, both of them success stories in their own right. David had proposed to Emma just before she left for college, and Amy had started nursing school, determined to channel her medical training into civilian healthcare. They were living proof that healing was possible, that the war didn't have to win. "A year ago," Marcus began, his voice carrying clearly through the auditorium's sound system, "I was a man who had forgotten what it meant to be alive. I went through the motions of living. I ate, I slept, I spoke when spoken to, but I wasn't really present for any of it. I was a ghost haunting my own life." He looked directly at Sarah, remembering the woman who had held their family together when he couldn't hold himself together. "PTSD is a thief," Marcus continued. "It steals your sleep, your peace, your ability to be present for the people you love. It convinces you that you're broken beyond repair, that the war has taken everything from you that matters. But here's what I learned. PTSD might be a thief, but it's not an undefeatable enemy." The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. "My call sign in Afghanistan was Falcon. I earned it during a mission where I fast-roped into a firefight to rescue 2 wounded soldiers. For a long time after I came home, that nickname felt like a cruel joke. Falcons are supposed to soar, to be strong and free. I felt like I was buried alive." Marcus paused, taking a breath, grounding himself in the present moment the way Dr. Martinez had taught him. "But working with other veterans this past year has taught me something about what it really means to be a Falcon. It's not about flying solo, high above everyone else. It's about using your vision to spot others who are in trouble and then diving down to help lift them up. It's about understanding that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is land long enough to help someone else find their wings." In the audience, Tommy was wiping his eyes. Rosa was nodding along with everything Marcus said. Jerry, now in his 70s, and still fighting battles from a war 50 years past, was smiling with the quiet pride of an elder watching the next generation carry the torch. "Recovery isn't a solo mission," Marcus said. "It's a team effort that requires you to trust other people with your pain, your fears, your darkest thoughts. It requires you to show up consistently, even when you don't feel like it, especially when you don't feel like it." He thought about all the Tuesday nights he'd sat in that circle, all the stories shared and tears shed and small victories celebrated. In the military, we have a saying, "Leave no one behind." But we don't always apply that principle to ourselves when we come home. We think we have to carry our burdens alone, that asking for help is weakness, that admitting we're struggling somehow dishonors the service of those who didn't make it home. Marcus's voice grew stronger, more passionate. "I'm here to tell you that the opposite is true. The greatest honor we can give to our fallen brothers and sisters is to live fully, to heal completely, to be present for the people who love us. The greatest service we can perform is to help other veterans find their way back from the darkness." The applause started before Marcus finished speaking, building to a standing ovation that filled the auditorium with the sound of hands clapping together. Veterans, families, and caregivers united in recognition of shared struggle and shared hope. After the ceremony, there was a reception in the lobby. Marcus found himself surrounded by people wanting to share their own stories, to ask about the peer support program, to thank him for putting words to experiences they'd thought were theirs alone. An older man approached, wearing a Vietnam veteran's baseball cap and walking with a slight limp. "Son," the man said, extending his hand, "that was the best damn speech about coming home from war I've heard in 50 years. You gave me words for things I've been feeling since 1971. Marcus shook the man's hand, thinking about Jerry and the way trauma echoed across generations of warriors. "Thank you, sir. And thank you for your service." "Same to you, Falcon. Same to you." As the crowd began to thin, Marcus found himself standing with his original group, Preacher, Tommy, Rosa, Jerry, and Amy. They formed a loose circle, the same formation they'd maintained every Tuesday night for the past year. "So," Preacher said with a grin, "think you're ready to take over the group when I retire next year?" Marcus looked around at these faces that had become more than friends. They were family, bound together by shared experience and mutual support. "I think we're all ready," he said. "That's the point, isn't it? To get strong enough to help others get strong." Tommy nodded. "Like you said in your speech, no one left behind." "No one left behind," the group repeated in unison, the words carrying the weight of promise and the hope of continued healing. Later that evening, Marcus sat on his back porch with Sarah and Emma, watching the sun set over the Colorado mountains. Emma was telling them about her environmental science classes, about the boy she was dating, not David, which had surprised everyone, about her plans to work for the National Park Service after graduation. Sarah leaned against Marcus's shoulder, comfortable and warm. "I'm proud of you," she said quietly, "not just for today, but for the whole journey, for choosing to get better instead of just getting by." Marcus wrapped his arm around his wife and reached for his daughter's hand. For the first time since coming home from Afghanistan, he felt truly present in his own life, not haunted by the past, not anxious about the future, but fully engaged with this moment, with these people who had never given up on him, even when he'd given up on himself. "You know what I realized today?" he said, looking up at the sky where the first stars were beginning to appear. "Being called Falcon was never about the mission where I saved Rodriguez and Patterson. It was about learning to use whatever strength I had to help lift up the people around me." Emma squeezed his hand. "So you finally figured out what your call sign really meant?" Marcus smiled, feeling more peaceful than he had since before his first deployment. "Yeah, kiddo, I think I finally did." Above them, the Colorado sky stretched wide and clear, full of infinite possibility. And for the first time in years, Staff Sergeant Marcus Falcon Rodriguez felt ready to soar.